I'm very pleased to have John Douglas here to chair this session. John is the President of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. He's also General Secretary of Mandate, one of three unions that oppose the austerity treaty, along with my own, PWU and Unite. John will chair this session, and I will hand over immediately to him now.
Good morning to the Greaves 25th Summer School. We have two very distinguished speakers here this morning who are going to address the topic of labour and the national question since 1913. There will be hopefully a period for time for questions at the end of it, and there'll be orderly questions. I'd please ask people to be respectful of everyone who would like to get in, and non-political manifestos or statements are not welcome. If you have a short question, ask it, and hopefully we'll get a straight answer. So stick to those house rules if you something. On my right hand side here, or your left as you're looking up the stage, we have Joe Jemison, has been a research director of the New York State AFL-CIO since 1989. He works mostly for the state legislature on issues on policy development, especially transportation policy and regional economic development. And Joe will, his topic will be James Connolly, long-term legacy in America. And my left, your right, we have Labour and the Irish Revolution. We have Professor Ruan O'Donnell, a historian from the University of Limerick. Ruan is well known to most of us, and he will give a brief paper on Labour and the Irish Revolution. So without further ado, I'm going to ask who's first? Joe's first, so Joe's go to the rostrum and a few words. Thanks.
Many people who have been my teachers and co-workers and co-conspirators over the years. The general theme of this panel is labor and imperialism. Oh, by the way, I should indicate you should have a handout which has a chart and also a glossary of some U.S. political vocabulary. Rather than torture you with Americanese and trade unionese, I figured it was more efficient to have some of these terms defined. And so you should have that handout. My co-panelist, Ruan, will discuss Irish labor and imperialism. Today I want to discuss American labor and American imperialism. I'm happy to be in a place where I can use the word imperialism. It is not often used in my country, certainly not in mainstream political discourse, and you have to speak to an explicitly left audience to be able to use the word. Well, maybe that will change now. We've had the events in Syria over the last month with the U.S. Acting so arrogantly and so militaristically. I think U.S. imperialism has been so gross in the last few weeks that maybe it'll be easier to use the word. I'm going to be trying to give a bird's eye view of U.S. Union history in the 20th century. That's a lot of ground to cover. And my talk is mostly about the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. When I talk about what the CIO's radical trade unionism was, and how it was crushed and why it was crushed, then I talk about the consequences of its destruction, and finally why it matters. Because we in the trade union movement in the U.S. are in a serious crisis, and I believe we need to re-examine the kind of left-wing trade unionism that it was represented by the CIO and before then by the IWW and James Connolly as part of the IWW. And so that is the Connolly connection. I know this is a center of socialist republicanism, the Greaves School. And the connection to that is that I argue, and have argued, that Connolly ought to be considered one of the grandfathers of the CIO. In fact, those of you who live in Ireland maybe saw a few years ago this RTE program, Ireland's Greatest. There was a vote. Connolly was one of the finalists. And when they realized he had spent a third of his career over in the U.S., Tyrone Productions sent over a team. And I argued that he was one of the founders of industrial unionism in the U.S. and ought to be given the credit for it, which he is not. So, but those comments got left on the cutting room floor. I make the argument. I have the notes from that interview with Joe Duffy over there, a few copies. So if you're interested in that, please take one. This is, please take a look at the chart that I handed you a moment ago. I consider it a dismal record, and it's quite humbling to me, because this whole period of decline is when I have worked in the U.S. trade union movement. This is color, but you have a black and white version. If you look at the slope of this line over the various periods of U.S. history, this tremendous upsurge was the CIO in the 1930s and 40s, excuse me. The stagnation began when the CIO was purged of the radical element, beginning in 1947. And the long sloping decline is 40 years of stagnation. And 40 years of stagnation sounds like a pretty damning indictment, but look at the line. The line shows decline from a 35% union density to just about 14%. And in the private sector, as John was just reminding me, it's even worse, 7%. So we're not too far away from complete irrelevance. And my overarching theme is that the history of American labor since the late 19th century has been the struggle between the right-wing tendency of class collaboration and pro-imperialism and a left-wing tendency of class struggle and anti-imperialism. Before 1935, before the birth of the CIO, the right-wing tendency was expressed in total devotion to craft unionism, refusal to organize semi-skilled, unskilled industrial workers, toleration of racial segregation, and support of American imperialism. Beginning in 1935, for 12 wonderful years, that tendency was beaten back by the early CIO, which engaged in militant strikes, opposed racial segregation, opposed World War I, and supported the Russian Revolution, just the opposite of what the craft union AFL was advocating. Now, to be clear, I'm going to be talking about union density, which is the measure of what percentage of the workforce is organized into unions. It's not the only measure, but it's probably the best single measure of the strength of a union movement. And it is not, I have to be clear also, that it's not only the militancy or the ideology or the politics of a trade union leadership that determines union density. There are other factors, such as the supply and demand for labor, or the political wins, favorable or unfavorable, or how strong employer resistance to unionism is. And there are even such imponderable factors as whether or not there exists an alternative social system, which did exist for most of the 20th century, which both frightened and restrained big business. But I argue that the politics, the structure, the ideology of the union movement is the necessary condition for union growth, even if it isn't the sufficient condition. And as you can see from that chart, we in the American union movement are in big trouble. And so either we change or we vanish into complete insignificance. The CIO, what was the CIO? It was born in 1935, and it was the single greatest achievement of the U.S. working class movement. And its creation had been the labor of 7 decades of militants, including Connolly and the IWW. It was like a river dam bursting. It was overflowing with pent-up anger after all these decades of lost strikes, AFL corruption, betrayal, the laziness of the craft union leaders who wouldn't organize. The CIO was essentially a left-center coalition, and within a few years it organized 6 million workers, doubling the size of the U.S. union movement and overshadowing the conservative craft AFL. Now, as you can imagine, there were moments of high drama in this upheaval that took place. And I don't think very many people know that the most critical moment was a very Irish moment, when the CIO was kind of bureaucratically, because of old habits, trying to organize the steelworkers. Well, somehow the auto workers didn't get the memo. And the auto workers spontaneously seized the largest factories of the U.S. auto industry. So the GM Chevrolet plant in Flint, Michigan, which had 20,000 workers, was seized by the workers, and they sat down, and the strike, the sit-down, went on for 42 days. And at that point, the governor of Michigan, who happened to be a fellow named Frank Murphy, decided that he was going to impose the law. He was under tremendous pressure from GM and from the government and from the right wing. And so he wrestled with his conscience, and his conscience did not win. And he decided to approach John L. Lewis, who was suffering from the flu. John L. Lewis was the head of the CIO, a mine worker, son of Welsh miners. And he said he was going to enforce the law. He had enough of this liberal tolerance of illegality. Anyway, this is the story. John L. Lewis, who had been ill, gathered himself for a final effort. You have to know that Frank Murphy was a descendant of somebody who had been, as governor of Michigan, he was one of the most progressive members of the U.S., of the New Deal administration. And his father had been involved in 1916, and his grandfather had been a Fenian. So John L. Lewis gathered himself, he was a very charismatic mountain of a man, gathered himself for a final effort. He turned all his scorn and eloquence on the guilt-ridden, suffering Governor Murphy, who had said he must uphold the law. Lewis said, with his voice rising with each sentence, "Governor Murphy, when you gave ardent support to the Irish Revolution against the British Empire, you were not doing that because of your high regard for law and order. You did not then say, uphold the law. When your father, Governor Murphy, was imprisoned by the British authorities for his activities as a revolutionary, you did not sing hosannas to the law. And when your grandfather was taken by the British government as an Irish revolutionary and hanged by the neck until he was dead, you did not get down on your knees and burst forth in praise for the sanctity and glory and the purity of the law that must be upheld at all costs. But here, Governor Murphy, you're doing that. And you want my answer, sir? I give it to you. Tomorrow morning, I shall personally enter the GM plant Chevrolet number 4. I shall order the 20,000 men to disregard your order and to stand fast. I shall then walk to the largest window in the plant, open it, divest myself of my garments, remove my shirt, and bare my bosom. Then, when you order the troops to fire, mine will be the first breast to be stricken by your bullets." And then Lewis lowered his voice and said, "And as my body falls from the window to the ground, listen to the voice of your grandfather as he whispers into your ear, 'Frank, are you sure you're doing the right thing?'" So this crushed Governor Murphy, and his better angels came to the fore, and he decided to revoke his own decision and not to evict the strikers. And this was the first and decisive CIO victory, which led to organization of the 6 million. But this was a pivotal battle, and it was the influence of Irish nationalism in America unto the third generation which had this result. This is not well known even in American labor history circles, and so I think people in Ireland should know it. Anyway, the CIO left wing was not all communists. There were many communists in it, but it was a left-center coalition. People assume it was all communist because the CIO was dismembered and dismantled by anti-communism after the World War II. But that doesn't mean the CP was utterly dominant. Only 16 of the 36 unions in the CIO were left-led, and left-led does not even necessarily mean communist-led. The communists were the best organized force, but the CP was a minority in the leadership and a small minority in the membership. Social Democrats and other centrists led many sections of the CIO. John L. Lewis was a conservative AFL leader for his whole life before 1935. And the next top CIO leader, Phil Murray of the Steelworkers, was a kind of a Catholic social democrat. He's fond of quoting Capel's social encyclicals. Some CIO unions were led by militants of no political party, and in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, sections of the upsurge were led by Trotskyists. What did the CIO stand for? Its essential ideas were industrial union, not craft unionism, organize the unorganized, left-center unity inside the movement, build the political independence of the two-party system, fresh militant tactics, including illegal ones when necessary, equality, inclusiveness, bring in black workers, immigrant workers, women workers, unskilled workers, and finally challenge the anti-worker, pro-imperialist aspects of U.S. foreign policy. And that meant during World War II, win the war. And after 1945, it meant oppose the Cold War and maintain the unity of what they call Big Three unity, UK, US, and USSR. The CIO, in this period, these 12 years, achieved all that was best in the New Deal, which was our greatest period of reform in the 20th century. The Social Security system, unemployment insurance, taxation of Wall Street, expansion of the state sector, affordable housing, some civil rights advances, massive aid to family farmers, financial regulation of Wall Street, even the good neighbor policy, so-called, a less aggressive U.S. policy toward Latin America. But then it ends in tragedy, this story. Biding its time until after 1945, the U.S. establishment, newly strengthened, split and crushed the early CIO, changing it into something that was acceptable to big business. When it arose in 1935, the CIO was overdue by decades. By 1945, its numbers had been augmented by wartime industrial growth, and it had about 6 million members. Similarly, newly strengthened was the U.S. ruling class. It was suddenly the supreme world power. It had been a major power before 1941, but now it was the absolute supreme power. And just how extreme this was is not often appreciated. According to the UN, in 1945, 50% of all world production took place within the borders of the United States, which only had 7% of world population. And the shift from depression-level suffering to wartime boom was also extreme beyond belief. In industrial areas, unemployment rates were about 60% in 1932, the depths of the recession. By the time of the 1944, the peak of the wartime boom, unemployment was negative, if you can imagine such a thing. 4% of jobs went begging. No, they couldn't fill them. Of course, there were 8 million men in the army. But anyway, to organize the world after this, to create the Pax Americana, to replace the Pax Britannica, the U.S. establishment had to do two things. It had to obtain large, stable markets, and it had to crush political opposition. So it feared the left. It feared the left in Western Europe, where conditions for radical social change were even more ripe. It feared the socialist camp, it feared revolutionary movements in the colonial world, and it feared the left at home. The CIO, having declared a moratorium on strikes during the war, launched strikes in every major industry, and was gaining, in 1946, had wage gains of 20 to 30%. So it was necessary for both imperialist and good old domestic capitalist reasons to weaken the CIO, and that was done. And the post-war era became the Cold War externally and McCarthyism internally. And 1947 was the year that everything changed. The Truman White House organized a Red Scare of unimaginable dimensions, and well exceeding what had been done after World War I. In March of 47, Truman demanded loyalty oaths of every federal employee. In March of 47, he proclaimed the Truman Doctrine, which was the start of the Cold War, giving military and economic aid to counter-revolutionaries in Greece and Turkey. In June of 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act became law. It crippled union organizing and began to split the left of the CIO from the center and the right. And the House Un-American Activities Committee, along with Senator Joe McCarthy, were activated and created a climate of fear for more than a dozen years. Frank asked me to talk a little bit about the Taft-Hartley Act. It was the legal dagger in the heart of the CIO. And apart from weakening its ability to wage strikes, it required union officers to sign non-communist affidavits with the government, and states, or 50 states, were allowed to pass so-called right-to-work laws that outlawed closed union shops. Half the states still have these laws on the books. let me talk a minute about that non-communist affidavit, because this audience might be, or anti-communist affidavit, this audience might be especially interested. It was not just a matter of an individual union official deciding in private to obey or not obey an unjust law. A union could not participate in normal activities of the National Labor Relations Board if the union leader did not sign the affidavit. In other words, if he did not, or she did not comply, the union could not organize new workers, could not negotiate contracts, could not do any normal union activity. So the union as a whole was damaged. So this complicated greatly the moral crisis. Most communist union leaders refused to comply and took the consequences, and so did their unions. Left unions began to shrink and were raided by right-wing CIO and right-wing AFL unions. If you decided to be a little bit Jesuitical, I think is the word, and sign an affidavit and not change your political party affiliations, if you were discovered and convicted of perjury, you faced serious jail time. Some non-communist leaders, like John L. Lewis, refused to sign, and so did their. But by and large, the repression worked, and so in a couple of years, about 75% of AFL unions, 75% of CIO unions, and 90% of AFL unions leaderships had signed the affidavit. Much of the Taft-Hartley Act is still in force, and that's one of the reasons you see that declining slope in that chart. They did get rid of the anti-communist. It was thrown out as unconstitutional in 1965. Too late to do any good for the people who had been its victims. The attack on the CIO was not only legal; it was ideological, and this gets us to McCarthyism. It was McCarthyism, really. It was the most extreme example of political repression in a developed capitalist country, short of fascism. Now, obviously, it wasn't fascism. It was not an open terrorist dictatorship, but it had some of the attributes of fascism. Anti-communism was its main ideology. It involved a total mobilization of the churches, the veterans groups, the government, the employers, Catholic Church in particular, the courts, the schools, Hollywood, veterans groups. And it had a mass base, especially during the Korean War, which was a war against North Korea and later China. Approval of Joe McCarthy's activities was high all through the war ended in 53. Through 1954, approval of him was high. If people, I know there are Woody Allen fans in the room, and I'm one of fans of Woody Allen's movies, but if you saw his movie The Front, it's about a nerdy screenwriter played by Woody Allen who is quite unsuccessful as a screenwriter, so he decides to make his living selling the screenplays of blacklisted writers to Hollywood producers. And it's a funny movie, but it does create the impression that McCarthyism was mainly about blacklisting Hollywood screenwriters or an academic or cultural phenomenon. And it was not. It was primarily an anti-trade union campaign. The benefits to the U.S. ruling class were immediate. When having purged the left wing from the CIO was a labor center of, as I've said, 6 million people. About 80,000 functionaries had to sign these affidavits. The CIO mutated from a left-center coalition into a right-center coalition. The radical CIO was crushed, it passed into history. And the purged CIO was born. And if you look at that chart, the purged CIO, at least sort of in a wobbly way, in an inconsistent way, maintained union density, but when it merged with it supported all the U.S. foreign policy initiatives, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, NATO, you name it, and it began to merge. It finally merged in a few years with the AFL, becoming the AFL-CIO. And as I said, 40 years of stagnation ensued. Now, what did we lose in America? What didn't happen that could have happened? I was asked by Tony, actually, why is it that in the days of Connolly, there were so many left-wing parties, some of which he joined? Socialist Party, Socialist Labor Party, left-wing trade unions like IWW, of which he was an outstanding organizer. Where did all that go? And the answer is this purge. The people who could have organized the transition from all those little parties to a mass party of the people based on labor were removed from the scene from 1947 to 1960. So the forces that would have naturally, in due course, organized a mass party of labor were not there to do it. I'll just mention these briefly. The South was not organized. Any of you, if any of you have ever traveled through the U.S. South in a car and turned on the radio, you would hear a backwardness that is really hard to believe exists in the 21st century. The most crude form of religiosity, racism that you could not get away with in a northern city or anywhere else in the country. The South still suffers from the original sin of slavery, and white masses there are still extremely conservative. And the only people who could have organized them, who had the politics and the energy to do it, was the left wing of the CIO, and they were gone. So the effort to organize, they spent 6 years and tons of money, was completely a failure. And naturally, we had a bellicose U.S. foreign policy, which has been on display for the last 50 years, especially in the last few years, and there was no extension of the New Deal social safety net. We've had wave after wave of shrinkage, and the country has been fundamentally distorted by war spending. If you consider that the U.S. outspends on military preparations more than the next 15 countries, the U.S. spends that all by itself, you can realize the degree of distortion in such an economy, which could have been spent on useful social projects. Why, if it is so obvious, as I have been arguing, that the CIO is the great model of U.S. union growth and progressive politics, why isn't it emulated? And the answer is the top union leadership today is not composed of unintelligent people, far from it. They are intelligent, but the cause is political and ideological. The cause is the opportunism embedded in the top leadership outlook on the world. Now, it amazes me that the word opportunism is not more discussed in progressives, even in progressive circles. Because I don't know how you do an analysis of working class politics without using that concept, opportunism, no more than you can do an analysis of international relations without using the concept of imperialism. The fundamental idea of opportunism is an alliance between capital and the working class. And our trade union leadership was left in 1947 with only people who believe in such an alliance in power. Since 1947 and the great CIO purges, social reformism, or social democracy if you like, first the most right-wing extremist kind, and later the more centrist kind, since 1995, has been in command of all the top positions. And the left, the Marxist left, the left generally has not been able to do anything about it. But social reformism cannot reverse our decline. It always tails, or almost always tails, behind the liberal wing of capital. And that is why the relationship with the Democratic Party continues. So our decline continues, and our revitalization debate goes on with no conclusion, and little progress, and no outcome. So let me get to my conclusions. If the long sweep of U.S. labor history demonstrates anything, it is that imperialism is the mortal enemy of democratic advance. And this requires some emphasis because it isn't obvious and it is contested, even today. In the 1950s and 60s, George Meany, an AFL craft union leader, openly spoke of that he had a deal with the U.S. ruling circles. He didn't use the word ruling circles, that's my word. But he felt that in return for advances in wages and benefits, if he supported U.S. foreign and military policy, he would get those advances. Well, the deal got called off, and as soon as it could, and imperialism has been taking back the concessions made in the early CIO period ever since. The crushing of the radical CIO, 1935-1947, by repression and fear was motivated by both foreign policy and domestic reasons. And I think of the two, the foreign policy was more important because it was a very unique circumstance that the U.S. was beginning to organize the world, reorganize the world. And this has to do with another question. Could there have been a different outcome? I see a lot, I think it can be debated, but I see a lot of contingency in this history. It might have turned out differently. The CIO was fated to be born at a moment, at precisely the moment when U.S. big business was being vastly strengthened by unique, never-to-be-repeated events, namely the military outcome of World War II. And in 1945, the U.S. emerged in a monopoly position not unlike that of Britain in the mid-19th century. So where is our salvation to come from? Look at that dreadful slope of the line. We continue, even after the so-called reforms of 1995, the downward slope continues. No union movement controls all the factors that determine its success or that determine union density, but it controls some. And the radical CIO, I argue, and the Connolly and the IWW legacy before it matter because U.S. unions can save themselves only by returning to the CIO's core principles, which more or less consistently challenged opportunism and imperialism. Back to the CIO would be a good slogan in my country, and only then can we change the slope of that line. Thank you very much.
Good to see such a great turnout on a nice day this time of the year. And obviously the lockout hasn't switched everybody off looking at issues of labour and social resonance. I've spoken here so often that I feel like I've never left the place. And I know at this stage, I literally know most of you, which is a tremendous thing. Suffice it to say that the title that I've been asked to speak to by Frank and my colleagues in the Greaves Committee notes Labour and the Irish Revolution is vast. And of course, I can do nothing more than to raise a few issues which I think might be worth speaking about this particular year. I'll say a little bit about the centenary aspect of this later on, and it may indeed come up as it did last night through the questions. I've taken the liberty of bringing with me a rarity, which is a script, for fear that I will speak for 15 minutes beyond my allotted time. But don't worry, I won't do that. So, in terms of where Labour with a small L and indeed a large L stands in relation to the Irish Revolution, and all of these terms are loaded, in the case of the Irish Revolution, often literally loaded, is a big question. In most countries in the Western world, of course, a labour movement, a national labour movement, has a major part to play in the advancement of social and political issues. At least they're supposed to. They're supposed to work on behalf of working elements in a given society. Now that can be delivered through trade unionism. It can be delivered through the type of legal, open organisation and cohesion that unions can deliver. It can also be delivered through the agencies of labour parties, national labour parties across the Western world. When labour parties gain a presence as either a majority party or in this case in Ireland, in Irish history, members of a coalition government, they have a chance to legislate or to at least represent the interests of broad sections, broad swathes of Irish society, whatever that might be. But at very least, Irish society is composed of citizens of this country. Now, our colleagues in the Battle 6 counties are not necessarily citizens as many of us would like them to be, but nonetheless, they are part of this society, vicariously so. What's interesting about Ireland, perhaps, is this, that neither the unions, which is their prerogative, nor the Labour Party actually embody the revolutionary or radical dynamism of the early 1910s and 1920s. And that is something that they have done themselves. This is something that they have decided to organise themselves along principles that have, in some ways, abjured the 1910s and 1920s, as they are entitled to do. Now, of course, that's a sweeping statement, and there are individual elements that certainly have pushed these agendas quite far. But let's consider the perspective of the labour historians themselves, the people who look at the mainstream labour tradition. I had a look at a very interesting book that came out last year to mark the foundation of the Labour Party, its centenary, which didn't really get as much attention as one might have imagined. However, Paul Daly, Ronan O'Brien and Paul Rouse have compiled a quite interesting book called Making the Difference, ? The Irish Labour Party 1912 to 2012. There are 15 contributors in that. including Kevin Rafter, David McCulloch, Eamon Gilmore, and many more. Now, a lot of those chapters, I think, and they're largely essays, but they're quite detailed essays, extensive essays, are very interesting. And I learnt a lot in reading that book, and it is certainly, I would recommend it to you. But it does give you some view of how the official mainstream historians of the Labour Party view that tradition now and in retrospect, in that sort of 100 years. Let's put it this way. Larkin and the ITGWU receive quite a few references, as they must do, as the progenitors of the Labour Party. And that's natural. The Irish Citizen Army gets none at all. The ICA is absent from that book. The Labour movement does not regard the ICA as part of its ideological DNA, which I think is amazing. Amazing. It's not necessarily that they're a motive driving central force, but certainly they must be in that tradition, I would have imagined. And I would have thought that any Labour movement would wish to disclaim it. They don't. They don't. That book is 246 pages, right? I'll just tell you what they do talk about. Well, I'll move along actually, because I don't want to get bogged down in this, because James Connolly's there. He must be, because he has to be entered in any discussion. He's there on 20 occasions in 246 pages. And that's often references in passing, okay? Captain Jack White has no reference. The man never existed in the Labour movement of this country. I'm about to break that news to you, my friends. That Captain Jack White is a figment of our collective imagination. He's some sort of baneful spirit out there in the ether who may or may not have existed, right? Except, of course, this is nonsense. I would have imagined that a party that had some sort of pretensions to internationalism would have been interested in the concept of the Spanish Civil War and defending the Spanish Republican democracy. It gets 4 references. Quite a few people who were trade unionists and Republicans and socialists travelled from the 32 counties, from Glasgow, from New York, to take part in that titanic and underrated ideological test. Now, there is, of course, an alternative evolution of the Labour Party there. And it's understandable, given the way in which things have happened, that the Workers' Party bears 6 references. One would have thought they deserved more than that, but they got 6 references. Democratic Left, of course, were extremely successful in terms of entering the Labour Party, and that is a very impressive feat what they managed to do there. And because of this, Conchita Rossa gets 3 entries, Pat Rabbitte gets 7, and Eamon Gilmore 10. Now, is this not supremely ironic? All of those men, to their credit, perhaps, were engaged at various stages in various capacities in the official Republican movement. And they do have a claim. They do have a claim for having held radical, assertive politics, even revolutionary politics. They do. And yet these people, which is their prerogative, do not see themselves in the tradition of the Labour Party as having a connection with the Irish Citizen Army. Now, in the years to come, it's quite possible, unless the government implodes, that Eamon Gilmore and his colleagues will be holding commemorative events, and as long as Prince Charles is defended, there may indeed be reference to the ICA. But the Labour Party per se does not actually see it as part of its makeup, which is interesting. So now we have another situation. We effectively have a new Labour in Ireland. A new Labour that was never revolutionary. Now, at least the new Labour in Australia had at one point a large colony of communists in it, which caused the Labour Party to split in the 1950s. And when with Paul Keating, etc., they moved in a very rightist direction. The Labour Party in England, under John Smith, who died too young, and Tony Blair, who's become a very interesting figure in modern history, a very impressive figure in many ways in terms of his achievements for his particular point of view, they had connections to various degrees with other international forces. And yet the Irish Labour Party seems to be this bizarre, free-floating entity. So they did not seek, actually, to radicalise and to address the social agenda. Now, I'm not saying that there's any truth in the rumour that they were a bizarrely well-educated middle-class party with a very strong presence in Dublin. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that whatever their various merits, and they're successful at getting into government, they have not dramatically improved the condition of Irish working people. That's what I would say. Now, it's not just them. I'm not laying this at their door. Every other major central party is equally deficient, all right? But just to say to you, they do not see a connection with the ICA. Well, moving on, This is, of course, the anniversary of the foundation of the Irish Citizen Army. And there's been very little discussion of it. There's been very little discussion so far this year, and the year is now rapidly drawing towards a close, of the foundation of the Irish Volunteers, Open the Heron, right? There's been an awful lot of non-joined up thinking and activities about the lockout. But it's just as well we've done something this year, because some people have done something this year about the lockout, because future generations are going to go nothing whatsoever about it, unless we tell them personally, or they manage to inform themselves. Because one of the real achievements of the Labour Party in government, and I have to say this because I'm very annoyed at it, is to be an attempt to abolish history as a subject. That is going forward. And it's not just that they're throwing out the junior cert lock, stock and barrel for good and for ill. History is being delisted as a course subject, which is a direct attempt to kill it as a leaving cert subject and to make a minority subject in the third level sector. Now, I could be accused of having vested interest in this because I teach in the third level sector. Well, I certainly do. But it really doesn't bother me if I'm speaking to 5 people or 500 people, not personally. However, I would prefer that the greater number of people in our society are given a chance to study in depth the origins of our people and to form the type of critical analysis that will enable them to make decisions about many things in their lives, to empower themselves to do that, the so-called transferable skills, to use that horrible jargon. But it is important. And if you consider that they've also managed to knock civics on the head, we have a new generation of people coming to this country which prides itself in its knowledge of its past and its glorious whatever, when it's allowed to. They won't know what it is or what to make of it, and they certainly will not be able to apply any lessons from the past to the future, their own lives. It will certainly make them much easier to be divested of the remnants of civil rights that we have in this society until we're legislated into some form of serfdom by the European Union. However, I'm going to say a little bit about the lockout because it hasn't really come up and it's not really scheduled to come up very much here as a case in point, in terms of where I think there was a great degree of not spontaneous but organised radicalism in our society, which is notably absent at the moment, we'll put it that way. The protracted violence of the lockout, and remember in August, September 1913, there were at least 15 major riots and innumerable skirmishes, set-tos, fracas between the locked out workers, the organised union men, their families, their supporters, the orchestrated attacks, and in some cases highly orchestrated attacks by the Dublin Metropolitan Police, which never recovered its moral ascendancy because of that, and indeed the very significant role in the suppression of the lockout by the Royal Irish Constabulary. Thoroughly now rehabilitated in our memory, but very, very integral to the bloody suppression of the lockout, that complicated series of concurrent events, which it's difficult to put a shape on that because it's so diffuse. But we know a few things. We know that on one occasion 200 people were hospitalised, and another 600 people were hospitalised. We know 2 men were beaten to death for no good reason at all, as if there ever can be a good reason, but there's never a good reason in the case of Byrne and Nolan. Suffice it to say that we're aware that this was significant. And it was the most concerted street violence in the history of modern Dublin up until that point in time. There's been a couple of riots since then, not least the Embassy riots of 1981, and there's more than one veteran of those riots in the room with us. But suffice it to say, I wasn't there myself, incidentally, but I was near at one time. Suffice it to say that that was important. That was something that was different. And in the context of the attempt to unionise unskilled labourers and making common cause with skilled labourers within one union, the IGWU, in concert and cooperation with fraternal unions coming out in support, pure Larkin militancy, that is very significant. And the state and the authorities knew that to be the case. Well, what I would say for the time being, just in passing, is what sort of country was it? Why did they do that? There are many reasons. I'm not going to have a long reflection on it. But in a city of over 300,000 people, there's a substantial amount of people living day in, day out in dire poverty, with a notoriously high rates of diphtheria and TB. In a country that in the early 1910s was still hemorrhaging population, had lost more than 50% of its national population since 1845, had seen at least 1.2 million put in burial pits during the so-called famine. They were traumatised, and these are the survivors. The same Imperial Parliament that through malfeasance and ineptitude had allowed this catastrophe, this existential catastrophe to befall our country, for which we will never be the same again, was operating in very much the same manner it had in the 1840s and 1850s. The Fenians, of course, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenian Brotherhood, from 1858 until 1867, and indeed to the bombing campaigns in the 1880s, had managed to prove that the revolutionary Republican dynamic extolled at first by the United Irishmen retained its appeal, and the torch was passed to another generation. And in 1913, one would begin by thinking that the conditions on the ground were suitable for something truly revolutionary to take place. Something literally revolutionary to take place. And of course that message was not lost on the revived IRB after 1907. Tom Clark was there. He was sent back to do this in 1907. And in 1907, 1908, you have this coalescence of various avenues of James Connolly, of James Larkin, of Tom Clark, not necessarily operating in direct cooperation at all times, they certainly were not, but operating along parallel lines and eventually intersecting with new figures such as Patrick Pearse, who lived in this very building. Now, I think it's interesting that two of the key figures of the lockout were returned famine immigrants. Larkin himself, of course, from a huge Irish conurbation of Merseyside, Liverpool, with Fenian ancestry in South Armagh and South Down, and they have good feelings up there, certainly. Suffice it to say that Connolly himself, as Greaves established, certainly in a manner that convinced most people that Connolly's Monaghan ancestors had brought him to the happenstance of a birth in Edinburgh, and the Irish diaspora in Scotland is one of the most underrated topics you can imagine, and in Britain generally, but particularly in Scotland, I think. Greaves himself, of course, was part of that diaspora, but that's a different matter. So, in April 1912, with the promise of a neutered House of Lords being forced to accept Home Rule, the third Home Rule Bill, in other words, to fulfil an agenda of the 19th century, in the early 20th century, to restore a modicum of authority to a devolved assembly in Dublin, which would have been a little bit like some form of half-assed assembly in Dublin, that was not good enough for the people who took the streets in 1913. And that is something that struck me when I was reflecting on this. In August, September 1913, the people who were out and locked out and kept coming back in the face of being battened by the DMP and the RIC, and under threat of being shot by them, incidentally, we'll come to that in a moment, they were not satisfied to wait for the Home Rule Bill to be enacted. That was due to take place in the autumn of the following year, and they would not wait. The street fighters would not wait, whatever Labour did. Now, the Labour Party itself, its origins have been contested, and it's an interesting discussion. I don't want to digress too much into it. But there was nothing inconsistent about the likes of James Connolly supporting the creation of Irish National Labour Party. It was going to be necessary to have some voice in this devolved assembly. And if they didn't, who was going to have it? William Martin Murphy and his ilk. They were the Irish establishment in waiting. They already had control of the mercantilist interests of this country, and from 1900, with the Local Government Act working its way through, they already controlled the corporations. You had a couple of tame and ex-Fenians out there, with the proud exception of the Daly family in Limerick, who remained actual hardcore Fenians. But generally speaking, you're looking here at the Catholic Irish middle class dominating Irish society. It is one of the reasons why the Belfast old money, shipbuilding money was concerned. And this Home Rule, Rome Rule, of course, is bullshit. That's the type of crude, crass propaganda you use to divide and conquer when you're faced with the threat of one man, one vote and democracy. And I always make this point when I speak about this period. We have to remember, and it's not often sufficiently expressed, Ireland and Britain were not democratic countries in 1913, 1914. They were not democratic. They were proto-democratic, they were getting there. France and Germany and other countries were getting there, but these islands were not democratic. And the first half-assed, near-democratic election in the history of these islands was December 1918, due to the opening up of the franchise. So you were not allowed to vote the government you wanted for the Home Rule Parliament. You were going to get what the middle class and the lower middle class elements wanted to be, represent their interests. And the people who took part in the lockout knew this. They weren't idiots. In fact, they were very well informed because they'd grown up through a particularly heady period of popular politics. And especially so in Dublin, we had the events surrounding the opposition to the Queen Victoria's Jubilee, the events surrounding the attempt to put a statue of Wolfe Tone on the corner of St. Stephen's Green, the very successful commemorations of Robert Emmet, when 70,000 people paraded through the city to a man whose grave had not been located, John O'Leary, etc. He wasn't in the grave then, and poor old Emmet was, well, we couldn't find it. These were heady times, and people were well informed. The discussions around Home Rule, at least, have concentrated the minds of what type of country are we going to have. And people voted with their feet, and they voted with their brickbats in 1913 to decide not the one the DMP want for us, not the one Martin Murphy wants for us. something else. So the radicalism was there. We can see it. It was visible. It was manifested. It was symptomatic of a deeper unease with the tenor of the times. And this is before, of course, you get the wild card of the arming of the UVF. The creation of the UVF was egregious enough, but their arming of it. And the same people and the same elements that threatened the striking workers with sedition and illegal assembly were the same ones that did not see fit to raid Major Fred Crawford's arms dump, which in the War of Independence in Belfast contained 250,000 rounds of ammunition held by the UVF. And the man had the gumption to request RIC protection for his illegal UVF arms dump during the War of Independence, lest the pesky IRA interfere with it. It beggars belief, but it's all very obvious. This is about imperialism, it's about establishments, and it's about traducing those who, if given the vote, would never have the likes of them in the House of Commons, let alone at all. Now, I'm going to read out to you a very brief quote from Larkin. Now, it's very familiar to many people here, and you will notice that I've left out some words, but otherwise it's verbatim, but I just left out some words in the interest of brevity. And this is the speech he made on the 26th of August 1913 in Liberty Hall, around the time that what became the lockout was becoming fervent, and the activities of the establishment were becoming quite clear in terms of their willingness to face them down. And here's what he said. It's worth just reminding ourselves for a minute. And remember, this is before the ICA had been founded, before the Irish Volunteers were in existence. I would advise the friends and supporters of this cause to take Sir Edward Carson's advice to the men of Ulster. If he says it is right and legal for the men of Ulster to arm, why should it not be right and legal for the men of Dublin to arm themselves, so as to protect themselves? You will need it. I don't offer advice which I am not prepared to adopt myself. So arm and I'll arm. You have to face hired assassins. And there, of course, he's thinking of Pilkington, the Brinklington Agency in the attacks on the Wobblies and other issues of literally assassination of trade unionists in other countries. I think I must be right too in telling you to form a provisional government in Dublin. Amazing statement. But whether you form a provisional government or not, you will require arms. For Aberdeen has promised Murphy not only the police but the soldiers. And my advice to you is to be round the doors and corners, and whenever one of your men is shot, shoot two of theirs. And cheers is how that went down, according to the Irish Times. The Irish Times reported this. The paper of the polite Protestant Unionist establishment of Dublin, as opposed to Murphy's own Independent, which kept talking about Larkinite scenes and rowdy Larkinites and the ilk, okay? Now that is literally revolutionary rhetoric. And that is, of course, exactly what happened from Liberty Hall on O'Connell Street on Easter 1916. The provisional government was formed in Dublin, at least was declared. The rights of Ireland to a full sovereign republic were declared. And there were the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizens' Army around the corners to shoot those who opposed them, including British forces in uniform, and indeed the DMP and the RIC. Now, this did not come out of nowhere. That moral threshold between attacking the police and shooting them, I believe, has very much to do with the actual radicalism and the sense of revolution tension that was abroad in this country in 1913 and was ultimately snuffed out by the victory of the wrong forces of the Irish Civil War. Now, the lockout itself, as I'm not going to go through it very much, you're aware of it, the famous Bloody Sunday on the 31st of August 1913, where in a planned operation with seditious legislation in position, there was a brutal attack on those who rallied in support of hearing Larkin make another seditious type speech. As it happens, he wasn't able to deliver very much of it, but his presence was the political point. He certainly was a man who led from the front and was a very interesting maverick perhaps, but certainly a very militant and inspirational figure for many forces. I noticed one thing about this. The fact that assembly had been proclaimed literally from Dublin Castle by Swift of the DMP meant that people involved in it, and certainly those who instigated it, could have been held liable for treason. In fact, if the Treason and Felony Act had been invoked in 1913, there would have been nothing to stop the government legally shooting or hanging Connolly and Larkin and probably Partridge and O'Brien and the other leaders of that titanic effort. That would have been perfectly legal. They decided not to. Why? Because they're probably afraid of making a bad situation worse from the point of view of the conservative establishment. They were afraid. The working people had flexed their muscles, and once they had the ICA behind them later on, they were even more difficult to take on. And this is where you start moving into the possibility of a coup d'etat situation occurring. which there are many in 1916 believed could work, particularly with diplomatic support from overseas. Clark and the IRB were watching these things with interest, and Pearse had shared many platforms with Larkin long before he was in the Volunteers. And they famously were a little bit unsettled by what they could not understand, this dynamic which they weren't in charge of, because the IRB remained an elitist, secret revolutionary underground. But they said this vis-a-vis Larkin's activities: this is the most hideous wrong to be righted. And in America, the organs of the Clan de Gael, the Fenian networks in America, such as the Irish World, and I'm indebted to a friend of mine, Owen Dugan, for getting me many copies of that very interesting reportage, a contemporaneous reportage of the Fenian prince, the Ford family. They were uncertain what was going on, because they wanted home rule. Because like many people supported home rule, including Connolly, they didn't necessarily embrace it as the end point, but as a start. It wasn't the best start, but if it had a Labour Party and a socialist militia to put manners on it, maybe it may get somewhere. And it was better to have some voice than no voice. At least that was the pragmatic point of view. But the Fenians, of course, did wish their Supreme Council to be in charge of all of this. And I suppose that's very much about the formal alliance brokered with Connolly in the advent of 1916. But the net result of these issues, of Connolly's rhetoric, I mean, this is the man who said, the next time we go out for a march, I want to be accompanied by 4 battalions of my own men. The net result of this organisation was the creation of the Irish Citizen Army, one of the most extraordinary and earliest social militias in the world. Ireland, as often, is stolen a march, no pun intended, on other countries vis-a-vis revolution radical organisation. It's quite interesting. It's a symptom, of course, of a long and sad history that these things must take place. But this is the fact. Now, the leading figure in terms of pulling this together is the Captain Jack White, who's ignored by the recent book of the Labour Party. And he's a very interesting man himself, as we well know, and he's worthy of a speech in his own right, which I would not be qualified to give, but there are people out there who could do. Shauna Case was on the wings, but he's a very querulous character. Countess Markovich, of course, a very interesting woman indeed, very prominent in all of these affairs since 1897 and before. But the creation of the ICA on the 13th of November 1913 was another stage. They'd been moving towards the creation of something like that, certainly since August, and quite possibly even before that. I couldn't tell you, but I wouldn't be surprised. It was remarkably well organised once it came into existence, and everybody took them very seriously as soon as they were in existence. They didn't have to prove a point once they marched and armed and organised. And they were treated, you will notice the significant decline in police-initiated attacks on workers once the ICA are in existence, because they created an actual tripwire counter-defence. But if it's a situation that even a small group of people are fired upon by the armed RIC, or indeed the British Army in Ireland, the Imperial Forces in Ireland, if they were fired upon in that format, who knows what sort of forces could have been unleashed. The establishment appreciated that, and they did not attempt to bodily suppress the ICA. Not in any way that they were legally entitled to do so if they had political will. They did not have the political will to do that, and I think that's very important. Now, because the Irish Volunteers come very quickly in, and due to their very broad-based appeal, which is many forms of nationalism, and republicanism, with the hidden hand of the IRB there from the start, in a central position there, the ICA tend to get occluded. But that's not the point. Ideologically, organisationally, I suppose historically, they are extremely significant. And it's not just about a head count. It's more to them. If the ICA wanted 2,000 members or 5,000 members, they could have organised along those lines, if they wished to. But they didn't. They had a very particular role to suit the conditions of 1913. Things were to change in the years ahead, of course. Now, there's much reportage, and I know there's some very authoritative voices on this question. There's much reportage about the alleged Larkinite scenes, to use that phrase again, as the Irish Independent called it, owned by Murphy, when the Volunteers performed in the Rotunda Rink. The place that had been associated with the original Irish Volunteers and indeed the United Irishmen. But suffice it to say that that's complicated. The ICA, if you think about it, being embodied as a precursor organisation, could have created a bloody massive riot at the Rotunda, where 5,000 plus persons had gathered. Instead of that, you have some shouting, some jostling. Captain White is on the stage. Kettle wasn't that popular, I understand, for his attitude towards blackleg labour. There's other issues happening. But they did not, at any point, form an opposition to the creation of the Volunteers. Far from it. Why? Because they were all working broadly towards the same objectives. Or at least that's what it appeared to be in 1913. And by 1916 they certainly were. I'll come to that in a minute. Now, even though the lockout was a technical defeat for the ITTW, the union survived and in the short term prospered. Yes, it is fair to say that perhaps by the impressive figure of 120,000 unionists in the ITTW by 1920 marked a zenith, but that's very impressive for an organisation that had taken a hammering from the state forces in these islands since 1913. It's very, very impressive. And by 1920, of course, the agenda had been completely changed by the War of Independence and the interim 1916 rising. Well, what are the lessons from the lockout? One is this. It was possible to mass large numbers of angry Irish people in the national capital, deposed or not. National capital in waiting at that point in time. They would take on the forces of law and order under certain circumstances. You could actually sustain a campaign of massive civil disobedience in the centre of the second city of the British Empire as such. The Irish volunteers tested this again on the 17th of March 1916, of course, when they had a dry run for the rising that would take place the following month, where a number of thousands of uniformed Irish volunteers were able to congregate, mostly armed, in the centre of Dublin City. And they're able to do that without the state forces interdicting them, with a very important lesson. The Fenians began to realise that there's something to this business of attacking the national communications nerve centre. And we do have an attempted modern-style coup d'etat in Easter 1916 because of these precursors. It's not just the UVF that brought the gun to Irish politics, yes, and the British Conservative Party opposition deserves an awful lot of censure for that. But it made the ICA logical, as Larkin and Connolly realised, and it made the Irish volunteers, or some form of Irish volunteers, all but inevitable, because the Fenians were not going to be left out. If that's the tenor of the discussion, they're going to be in it. And it's going to take on its own dynamic. Now, here's the problem. Outside forces that had nothing really to do with the interests of Irish people, not by our origination, destroyed all sorts of capacity for international democratic and socialist growth, namely the catastrophic First World War, the Great War from August 1914. And we really should start talking a little bit more next year about the origins of the First World War, as Roy Johnson has been calling for last night, and I totally endorse that for what it's worth. That set back almost everything progressive in the Western world, and then by extension the rest of the world, due to the imbalance between the imperialised zone and those who are imperialised. It certainly made it very, very difficult to build a sort of fraternity and true internationalism that had been looking quite possible in 1914. Now, on the other hand, you had the extraordinary victory of the Bolshevik forces in 1917 and their victory in the even more extraordinary Russian Civil War, which was no fluke. I mean, you're now looking at a totally new form of social political organisation, and that also had massive ramifications. Ireland perhaps being less affected by that directly than others, because we remained in the sort of the maw of the British Empire, actually, and then through post-colonialism. However, that's a big discussion. Larkin at this point had gone to America. He had interacted with the Klan in America. He was part of the effort to build up a strategic alliance with Germany. He was very interested then with the possibilities of Bolshevism after 1917, and certainly he entered a phase where he would have been regarded by many people as a communist. Now, he should not, in his later life, I think, be utilised as the central narrative of what was going on in Ireland. He was such an individualist, unusual man. So he's not typical. And maybe it's fair to say, as Niamh Purcell has argued, that James Connolly wasn't typical either. Well, that's true. They're extraordinary examples of what can happen in certain contexts. And just because they're not typical doesn't mean they're not of those times. But again, we don't need to get bound up with some of their private documentation that seems to conflict with other aspects of their lives. I mean, there's no such thing as coherency in anything. Coherency is a complete illusion. A narrative structure, even that I'm attempting now, is not possible. This is just simply one level of consciousness with many more in this room. And I don't really know how what I'm saying would mean to any one of you. And perhaps I'm not saying what I actually think at all. Don't you worry, I won't be doing it very much longer today, because lunch beckons. Now, I would like to say one thing. If we're looking at the issue of where did this radicalism go, there are some clues in the case of Ireland. It went into Easter week. It went into the war for independence, not war of independence. And unfortunately, it was defeated, in my opinion, by the military victory of the Free State forces in the Civil War, and in particular the Common Gael governments that followed in its wake. These are big issues. These are issues for many days' discussion, but I just want to, again, just push them out there and see if you think there's anything to them. The 1916 Proclamation is a manifesto. It's not simply a declaration of the Irish Republic. It's not simply that, although that makes it incredibly important. It is partly a manifesto. And it does include many phrases that are totally resonant of the socialist agenda in these islands and internationally. Now, some of them, we have our own claim to this. We don't need international people to give us our theory or our experience or to narrate our own history to ourselves. Although sometimes you feel we need a few more historians to tell us our history when we're not allowed to write it or hear it or be taught it. But suffice it to say, it's in there. We had Lawler. We had other figures in our history who were, Lenin was reading about Ireland, and there is a certain amount of interconnection. But I was just going to read you a couple of very brief extracts. Just see, does this sound like something that a right-wing Catholic conservative would say, which would be their entitlement, of course, they're citizens also. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefeasible. That is not crass reductionist nationalism. It isn't. That is not crude irredentism. That is progressive, right? The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens. Even using the word citizens in those days was important, because we weren't citizens, we were subjects of the British Crown in these islands. We were imperialised. The British didn't want that for their own people, and certainly not for the likes of us. Well, what would happen if the Irish got out of the bloody imperialist box? Where would India be? You know, the engine of their wealth. No subways built in London without the Indian wealth.